Sometimes to truly make a change, you have to do something big, something dramatic, and something that ensures that you never go back to the emotional and physical traps that have made you so unhappy. One of the best days of my life was the day I smashed my scale. I loved it so much, I think we should all do it. And to make rejecting diet culture even more exciting, I'm giving away free advice and prizes, including a full year of body kindness coaching with me. So to join, visit bodykindnessbook.com/BK Scale Smash. That's bodykindnessbook.com/BK Scale Smash. There you give your name and email and you'll get the motivational coaching from me. Lots of ideas for how you can participate right there on the page. And I look forward to joining you all summer long while we work together to just tell the world that we don't need scales, we don't need judgment, we don't need criticism. What we need is body kindness. Because real health is about being good to yourself. It's time for Body Kindness, the place where all bodies fit and weight is just a number. Hi, I'm Rebecca Scritchfield. I'm a registered dietitian and nutritionist, a certified exercise physiologist, and author of the book Body Kindness and host of this podcast. I'm so excited to bring you this topic today. It is about hunger, the book by Roxane Gay, which is a bestseller. I knew it would be. And it is a conversation with a fellow helping professional, Dr. Maria Paredes. She is a licensed and professional counselor and a clinical supervisor and a certified eating disorder specialist, an approved IADEP supervisor, and she owns Three Birds Counseling and Clinical Supervision, and she's based in Greensboro, North Carolina. I really wanted to have a conversation to process what I was experiencing just as a reader and as a helping professional reader and as someone who embraces the health at every size philosophy and uses that in my practice and work. And I am a strong supporter of the fat acceptance movement. I hope to do my best to be an ally. And I was eagerly anticipating this book. I was moved so many different ways. I listened to the audiobook. I love audiobooks. I get through books so much faster when I do that. And hearing Roxane read her own book was very, very powerful for me. I listened to it twice in a row and I was just like, I got to do a podcast on this. And it's, you really have to get organized. There's a lot of work that goes into podcasting and figuring things out. And I really felt a strong need to do something sooner rather than later, but also see how else I could contribute to what else was out there. Definitely take a look at the show notes because I'm going to share a few of my favorite interviews that Roxane Gay herself from her Twitter feed said that she thought the interviews were good. But I highly recommend that you get the book if you feel like you're in a good place to read about trauma and also to kind of read what it's like, no matter what size body you're in, to read her perspective of what life has been like in her body. I think there's something there for everyone. And I am so grateful that Dr. Paredes agreed to chat with me. I think it's really special that you have two helping professionals who support health at every size and who also support body autonomy. So we just have an interesting, frank conversation about what our experiences was like reading the book. And we could have talked forever. So we just touched on what naturally came up. And if you have a chance to do this in your book club, I definitely recommend it. I would love questions, comments, always. You can email me, Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com. Would love if you could take a minute and leave a rating and review for this podcast as well. And yeah, just have a listen to our conversation. And FYI, I did pitch her publicist for Hunger for Roxane Gay to come on the show. And while I eagerly await a yes, so we could talk to her directly, I'm happy to bring this to you. I pitched an angle for us to talk about how she has found her inner caregiver voice. And I think she's touched on it on some interviews. I would like to focus on that because I think that's where she could be really helpful to listeners of this podcast, because we're all working on firing those critics and promoting those caregivers. And it is hard work. Okay, without further ado, enjoy our conversation. Thank you for joining me today on the show.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I have 2 girls, so I could really relate to that last line. I feel like everything I do in my life revolves around fixing or changing the world for them, or if not, at least helping them be more resilient.
Mm-hmm. You know, I grew up with 4 brothers, and I always thought I was going to be a mother of sons. And I think it's both the most awesome thing and the scariest thing to have girls, because there's so many, there's just so much that they're up against. But I also think that girls are so powerful and can do so much. So both scared and excited about what's to come.
Yes, I know. How old are they?
The oldest is almost 6. She'll go to kindergarten. I have a 3.5-year-old and I have a 14-month-old. So we are in it.
You are in it.
Yeah.
Mine are smattered in there. So turning 5 and just turned 3. So
Awesome. Yeah, we've got some matches then.
Yes. Cool. Well, before we get into our topic today, I'd love for you to just fill listeners in on maybe a little bit more about you and your current line of work.
Yeah. So I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I have a private practice called 3 Birds Counseling and Clinical Supervision. That last part of the name is intentional because I try to keep about a quarter of my practice dedicated to clinical supervision. So I have a lot of counseling trainees who have graduated and they're working towards getting licensed. Occasionally I provide some supervision or consultation to also dietitians working with eating disorders. I really value that mentorship piece and enjoy it because I always learn so much from them. So that's really fun. I've really hopped around at different times in terms of my career. So I've been a college counselor at Wake Forest University, at UNCG. My master's was actually school counseling, which I think seems random now in some ways, but really integrates with everything else. I was a grief counselor at hospice and palliative care. I've done some inpatient work. So all of that I feel like has contributed in different ways to get to me to where I am now. But I really love now just mostly doing the counseling and clinical supervision and teaching occasionally on the side.
Yeah, I mean, teaching and the clinical supervision, I mean, those are essential roles to fill if we're going to take the progress of our generation and fuel the next generation. Because
Absolutely. Yeah, no. Yeah. I think you're going to be at BETA. I think I saw that, right? At the Binge Eating Disorder Association conference, which is such a great conference. So I am really excited to be presenting with a couple students, actually. One's a nutrition student and one's a counseling student who both identify as fat and both happen to be women of color. And what we're going to talk about is just how important it is to recruit more fat students to be in these fields. We're talking so much about inclusivity and making sure all voices are represented. And I think the best way to do that is actually in our training programs. It's something we're aware of even today. I'm so excited to talk to you about this book, but something that was definitely on my mind as I was getting ready for today is here we are, 2 white women and 2 smaller sized white women. I'm making some presumptions, but talking about a Black queer fat woman. And, you know, I think that a better kind of conversation would be if we could have more diverse voices out there talking about all of these issues. So.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up because I've been following that Hunger was going to come out when it was supposed to come out in 2016. You know, I had first heard of Roxane Gay through Bad Feminist, and I loved that. And so when it finally came out this year, I couldn't wait. I do Audible audiobooks. I just love being able to focus on that. And then there's always something else I need to do. And I listened to it twice. And it was so interesting because I did a few social media posts from quotes from her that I thought were so powerful to use as a teaching opportunity. And I so desperately wanted to do a podcast about it. And just between schedules and trying to figure, you know, its podcast requires so much planning. And I was like, but this is a very timely topic. And so much of what made me say, no, forget it, just you're going to miss the opportunity was because I wanted to really well, I'd want to interview Roxane Gay herself. Like that would be the ideal. And so I was like, okay, how can you be helpful here? So my intention is in sharing a few of the best helpful interviews that Roxane Gay herself said this was a good interview in the show notes. So those links are all in the show notes. And you're exactly right. I think that in an ideal world, I would have been able to pull together a much more diverse panel discussion podcast. But this really came down to, so we're both on the Health at Every Size group together. And I know you wanted to do a book club with professionals for this. And I was like, I really want to do a podcast. So I thank you for agreeing and really at acknowledging that and being vulnerable with this idea of let's acknowledge our privilege as smaller bodied white women who really don't know her experience as a person of color, a person in a large body, the daughter of immigrant parents. So multiple intersectional oppressions have fueled her life. And so I don't think this conversation is meant to be not even like a critical review, book review, but to me, it's more about, I want to seek to understand what I was reading and honestly help other readers understand, because the one thing that I think, even if there are folks in the fat acceptance movement, I'm sure have challenges with the book in certain parts. And I'm sure in our private book club, we'll be able to talk about that. But the fact that this is a bestseller is huge, because she says things that I can't get on the radar screen of certain publications or, so it's like, let's try to find some appreciation for how we can respect her experience as her own experience and figure out, to me, it's like, it's almost like you and I are going to process what we read in the book together in the way to help others, not try to judge or rate her experience, because that's not our place.
No, I don't think it's our place here. I don't think it's our place. And I don't think it's my place as a therapist when I work with folks. So work with a lot of people with diagnosable eating disorders, or not necessarily a diagnosable one, but just a history of disordered eating and body image concerns. And I'll have a lot of people who will have some shame about telling me some behavior. And because folks know what I do in my philosophy, a lot of times, what the shame will be about is that they are wanting to diet or that they're wanting to lose weight. And they'll describe sort of being afraid that I'll be disappointed. And one of the things I really try hard to communicate to them is, it's not my job to be disappointed with them, or to judge what they end up doing. That I want to help them be able to make full autonomous decisions about their bodies. But I don't want to ever presume that I know what's right for someone else's body, including see as harmful, but who am I to say you should or shouldn't do anything about your body, whether it's dieting or otherwise. I believe in the research that says that dieting works very rarely for folks and that it can be really harmful for healing one's relationship with food and body. But I strongly believe in autonomy for people, especially when we're talking about someone who represents communities who have been oppressed and not had autonomy or control over their own bodies for centuries. So, I don't know if you've ever heard the expression, like, being so left, you're right. Sometimes I find, and I strongly adhere to being I'm proud about being a feminist, but I get frustrated sometimes when some feminists turn against other feminists, or just turn against women in general, or expect more from women than we expect sometimes from the larger culture. We look at dictators, they're successful by pitting the oppressed against each other. And I think the diet industry has been really successful at pitting women against each other. So I've been really frustrated. I'd love to hear your impression of this, but just when we see someone who's famous out there who ends up deciding, like someone who's in maybe the body image world, ends up deciding to do something like weight loss surgery, it feels like the hounds are released, on them. And again, I cannot ethically promote or support, support's the right word, suggest weight loss surgery. I think that it can be really harmful to people. I hope less people feel that they need to pursue it because it ends up not being, I think, helpful for folks. But again, who am I in my body to judge someone else and what they do to their body? So I've had a hard time with how people have sort of gotten onto others for decisions that they're making about their bodies.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. And I think that some of it speaks to when you are a clinician and you work with individuals and you really get the privilege of understanding the whole complex story. And then you really start to understand about your role as being a helper and being non-judgmental. And I would say I am 100% aligned with you. In the marketing, I will talk about, do you have weight concerns, right? Because I'm trying to be the least stigmatizing as possible. And frankly, I want people who feel attached to diets or think their body is a problem. I want them to find me instead of somebody else who is not going to give them the good body kindness loving I'm going to give them, But, you try to do it as a non-shaming way as possible. And when big celebrity stories break, and they're going, I get it. I mean, I don't know what it's like to be a celebrity, but I imagine that you lose control of your narrative unless you actively take it. So why not, agree to do an interview about your weight loss surgery, because the paparazzi will cover it anyway. And it really sucks that they just can't have complete privacy and you don't know their reasons. And when you look at how awful diet culture is, it almost becomes understandable. So in the same way where you say, I don't condone it or would not recommend this as a healthful course of action for you. But when you look at how harmful psychologically diet culture is, it's not surprising when people do resort to it.
And of course not.
Yeah. And I don't think it's beneficial to... I think that everyone has a right to share their opinion too, and that opinion may not be in line with somebody else, but it's one thing to reiterate your opinion while you respect a person's autonomy and then just move on. Because it can be really distracting, when you get all up in somebody else's body business. And I think that if we can all, somebody who had weight loss surgery could still work to end weight stigma and diet culture for the future. So we need as many people as possible doing that.
Totally. And, I in my career, I've worked with a lot of victims, survivors of domestic violence and physical abuse. And what we know in that field, I'm actually about to put a blog piece up about this, is that on average, it takes people 7 times to leave an abusive relationship. Wow. So 7 times of leaving and going back, leaving and going back. And so when you learn about working with domestic violence victims, survivors, it's really important you learn not to push them, right? Like if I tell someone you need to, just leave this, a-hole or whatever, then when they go back, they're not going to trust me. They're going to feel judged and they may not get the support and help that they need while they're still in that abusive environment. So I think okay, if diet culture is an abuser, and I think people just, when they describe it to me, it sounds like that, they don't have control. It's this, thing that's over them, that makes them feel dumb and, low self-esteem. So if it takes them 7 times to leave diet culture, don't we want to not shame them when they go back, but still support them so that when they are ready and when they are able to rally the resources, that they will be in a better position to finally leave. So whether someone has a history of an eating disorder or they've done weight loss surgery or whatever it might be, I want to support them so that when they're ready, they can finally leave diet culture all to begin with. And what I would add to that, though, is in some ways, because of the world we live in, it's impossible to fully leave diet culture, so we can maybe try and lose our attachment to it. But what makes it so hard to fully leave, especially for those who are in the spotlight, is that we can't leave it. We live in this culture that values thin over fat and all of that.
That's an excellent point. And honestly, something I struggle with on the regular, like in my personal life, it took years, but I have finally disentangled and reframed things like movement, right? So, and frankly, not all my movement is joyful. Like I'm training for a marathon right now, and I've done marathons before. This is something I chose to do because a good friend of mine who I used to run with before kids said, hey, I'm doing this. It's in Utah. We'll have fun. Kind of sold it to me. Right. But, and I've even said on social media, like, I'm not doing this for my health, actually. You don't have to do a marathon to be healthy. And there's some decidedly unhealthy things about it. And so, but the point of it is I would also never say, well, I'm doing this marathon because I hope to lose weight or because I want to change my body. But, I worry, like, if I go to a yoga class and post my feet on the yoga mat, am I making people feel inadequate, or are they thinking I'm subscribing to diet culture? When I post this yummy meal that I'm proud of making, are they like, oh, she's subscribing to diet culture? And I know in my head and in my heart, it's not, right? Like, there's an overall pattern, and I show the ice cream cones and the salads. But I think that that's part of it. You never really, we're all in a diet culture, but also everybody's in a different place.
Totally. Well, and there's the privilege that comes, post something with quote unquote unhealthy food versus healthy food, just how that's seen differently versus someone in a smaller body. And then even just someone who's a dietitian like yourself, just the assumptions that people put on that. Yeah. It's interesting. You said before about this narrative and people, and it made me think of a quote that I happened to highlight, which is funny because it's right in front of me from Roxane's book. And it's in chapter 31. And she says, when you're overweight, your body becomes a matter of public record in many respects. Your body's constantly and prominently on display. People project assumed narratives onto your body and are not at all interested in the truth of your body, whatever that truth might be. And I think that's just what you just described, right? It's like, you're the only one in your body, in Rebecca Scritchfield's body. So you know what you're doing, and whether it's like connecting you more to yourself, disconnecting you more from yourself, whether it's healthy, how it's healthy, in what ways it's healthy or not, and all of that. And, how can we know that just from looking at the external?
No, that is a really powerful quote. And I listened to an interview that she gave. I'll include the link in the show notes here. It was a really good, lengthy interview where they took callers. And that was one of the things that Roxane Gay, that she said she actually did not want to write this book, but she felt she had to and needed to. And that one of her hopes was that people would be more understanding that every individual body has a story and you don't know their individual stories. So please stop judging them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. And especially, a word that we haven't even mentioned yet is just trauma. And both like trauma, like event trauma, like abuse, and she describes a lot of that in the book, but also I think the trauma of being a woman in a world that values women less than men, or the trauma of being a size that's valued less. Like, that's traumatic in of itself, even without specific traumas in the past. So I'm just not one for like judging other people's decisions about their own bodies.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up the word trauma, because as a registered dietitian, I don't know. I mean, I'm on the advisory board for a program that needs to comply with even the latest requirements to become a dietitian. And so I feel like I'm still on top of the changes. And let me tell you, we are not trauma informed folks. And that's just crazy to think about what I needed to learn on the job. Can you tell the listeners, because I really think people need to have trauma normalized. I think they need to think that like they need to be, trauma can be very, very big, but I think most people, in order to call it trauma, it has to be like a near-death experience. So can you help people understand what trauma is and why it can be damaging to well-being?
Yeah, sure. So, I don't have like the exact diagnosis in front of me, but it's a deeply disturbing experience, deeply distressing experience. Often it's typically something that is outside what you would normally experience in the world and sort of out of the ordinary of your general experience. And there's more to like the official definition in that way. When I talk with folks, the way that I try to explain it, I really believe in the idea that it's an injury to the brain. So the brain wants to be able to predict the world. Like, I think we are beings that like to be able to try and predict what's going to happen, even though we don't ever know. And when something happens in our experience that's so far out of what we could even anticipate, our brain doesn't know how to process it. So, for example, a big one is 9/11. Before that happened, there really wasn't a schema in people's brains for this idea that planes could fly into these enormous buildings and that those buildings would come down. And so, it's the brain doesn't have like a schema or a way of processing it. Now, the other piece to that is what people's agency was in processing the trauma. So, you can have a group of people who all experience the same trauma, but in that experience, the folks who were able to have agency, not because that's something better or worse about them, like they're a better human being or more capable, but the folks who were able to do something and feel some efficacy, some agency through that trauma have better outcomes than the folks who maybe were immobilized and not able to do anything through that. So in the healing of trauma, what we often try to do for folks is help them be able to release some of that energy that they never were able to release when they experienced the initial trauma, and have some agency over their life, which is even more reason when I think of like sort of systemic trauma, racial trauma, like food trauma, we're taking it to a broader way of looking at it. I think we really need to honor people's autonomy and give them agency in this, including if they make quote unquote bad decisions about their body, and I think this is particularly important for women when so much of our consent has been taken from us, and for people of color especially too, when there's been so much consent and autonomy taken from groups of people. We really need to make sure that we're honoring their ability to make decisions and have autonomy over their lives, even if that means decisions that may not be what we might perceive as healthier for them. Certainly we want people to be safe and, all that. But outside of that, I want to help people be able to have ownership of their own bodies and their own decisions.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And thank you for sharing that definition, because I think that I recommend people to read Hunger. I think it's a very good book. I mean, it's a memoir. So this is Roxane Gay's experience. So she calls it Hunger, a Memoir of My Body. So it's her experience of what it's been like up until the point when she wrote it, of being inside her body. And I think that that there's information for everyone, and really any helping professional, because a lot of times I think that if you don't know that the difficulties people can deal with, then you don't know the potential harms that you can be contributing to. So, I don't necessarily think we're going to get, we could say that the courses have to change and all these, what would we do if we could clean slate and fix every little thing? But anyone can choose to buy a book, read a book, and learn from someone else's experience. And especially people with thin privilege will be surprised, unless they're deep in health at every size and the fat acceptance movement. I think people with thin privilege will be surprised. And I think people in large bodies will feel, maybe in some ways, will be able to, yes, I feel that, I felt that, yes, that's happened, and not necessarily align on everything, but I do think that there would be some agreements with some of her experience, but not that you even need to have it, because she's a person of one, so it's just her experience and nothing else.
Well, something you said early just then, you said it's a memoir of being inside her body. And it made me think, like, I thought that a lot when I was reading it, that she really was talking about her body as if it was a separate entity. She described it as like a cage, as something she couldn't get out of, as something, she wanted to change. And it made me think about a lot of the work I do with folks on healing their relationship with body is sort of becoming more embodied. So I wonder, like, for her, instead of feeling like she's inside her body, what it would be like to experience both sort of being her body, like less of a disconnection from it. But I also wonder, with the amount of trauma that she experienced, how possible that is. And I think that's always something to consider with clients or for folks, is for some folks, and I think about clients of mine who've had extreme childhood sexual abuse, trauma, all sorts of different things. Like some pain is so painful that people choose not to distance themselves from it, I guess is maybe a easy way to say that. And becoming more embodied may feel too scary. I think it can be incredibly healing and helpful, and I think it's possible for a lot of folks. But I also think sometimes remaining separate from the body is the only way that some people have learned to be able to keep moving through this world and this life that they've experienced. So,
yeah, that's a really good point. It's like on an individual basis, a person is going to figure out through, and Roxane Gay said, like, I've done my therapy work, but so through doing the work, they will get to the best place that they can get for them. And that doesn't necessarily look like as far as we know somebody else could get, that it is a personal journey. And
totally. And there was points that I was listening and I was going, and this is, I mean, what a God complex, the next thing I'm going to say, but there was part of me as I was listening going, oh my gosh, I want to counsel her. If only she was my client, here's what I would do. And here's the messages I would want her to get. And I had to check myself so many times and go, that's a lot of assumptions that she hasn't been through really good therapy, or that, that the point is even to fix some of what she's saying. And, it just made me really try to be kind of, just check myself. Like, Maria, you're making a lot of assumptions, based on what she's sharing. And I do believe that folks can heal and can create more peace with their body and food, but that, just like you said, it's going to look so different for every person. And some are going to choose to only go so far. And, do we really want to force people to heal more? Like, you have to heal more. Like, there's places where people are only willing to go. And man, I don't want to judge that.
Well, let's kind of try to track back a little bit on this trauma angle. So I've listened to a lot of the different interviews and everything like that, and you can listen to an excerpt of the book or look at some preview pages on Amazon, and we're already, recommending that people get it. But she basically, as a very young girl, I think she was 12, had a significant trauma. So for you being the psychologist person, help listeners understand the severity of the trauma with respect to the age she was, what her brain was capable of doing, because I think that really plays a critical role in looking at the decisions she made and kind of like why she did what she did.
Yeah. And just one, sort of minor edit, but I'm actually not a psychologist. My training is as a counselor. So,
counselor.
Yeah, that's okay. It's just a different profession. So we do mostly the same stuff, but I don't identify as a psychologist. So, she was 12 was my memory. I don't know if that's the same as what you said, when she was raped. And, at that age, like, girls are beginning, or have for a while, like experiencing their body, learning new things. Developmentally, from a cognitive standpoint, they're still very egocentric. So seeing the world as revolving around them, and that is actually a really protective thing, because it can help us, sort of ask for what we need from the caregivers around us. But a difficult thing about being egocentric is that when these kind of traumas happen, it's very easy to internalize them as our fault. And, there are other aspects of egocentrism where at that age, we assume that we're more powerful than we are, so we assume when things happen that somehow we created them in being. And so, if you're raped at that age, it's going to be pretty easy for the brain to take that in as this was something that was my fault, or that I deserved. And this is also against the backdrop of, enormous, tremendous messaging that females get, that they should also take on ownership of the things that happen to them, that this is okay, and, the hypersexualization of girls and all that. So just from a brain-wise, you at that age, even though you're beginning to formally think and take the perspective of others, you're still so egocentric. And so it's going to be very easy to internalize it as your fault. That's the biggest thing I think of there. I also think she described also living in a lot of different places. And I wonder just about attachment and how that might have played in. It sounds like she has really good and happy and positive relationships with her parents, but I always want to sort of like think about how attachment might have played a role, because I think it's such a important factor in that. I didn't think that there was it didn't sound like poor attachment to her family, but I wondered about the attachment to herself, like to her body. And that makes me think of what I just said before of like, she was really talking about her body being separate. So, I wonder, like, as a Black woman, and I think she identifies as queer, in different ways, you get messages from the culture that those things are not as good or not as okay. And so I wonder if you learn to not attach in a healthy way and start to disconnect. I wonder how much that would also play into being able to trust your own consent, because if you're not attached, and if you are, sort of, not feeling a strong attachment to your body, then it's going to be harder to also know when it was her fault. Not that it's like the onus is on her to be able to do that, but that even the idea of knowing what you want to consent to may be difficult if you're not really attached to your own body. I don't know if that makes sense, how I'm describing that.
Well, it does make sense. And so I have a couple thoughts to add to that, back to around the 12-year-old time. I remember reading that core to her identity, and this would link up with the family identity, was that she was to be the good Catholic girl, and that good Catholic girls were not allowed to have premarital sex. So, and she says now that she wishes she could have gotten the 12-year-old girl to tell her parents, because she would have avoided a lot of pain and suffering. I think and so she believes that now, but that at the time, like, she doesn't blame the 12-year-old self. The 12-year-old did the best she could, which I think is a very important sign of healing. But that created the need for the cage, like the shame of losing value in her parents' eyes, to be able to say this happened to me was just too much.
Mm-hmm. But that's kind of what I mean about, like, even consent is like, I'm thinking of an article I wrote, and I'd love to share it with you. It's called "Why We Need Women to Shimmy and OOO," and it's basically about orgasm, and it kind of goes into this idea of consent. And that's kind of what I mean. It's like, women in general, we're taught that we're not supposed to have wants and not supposed to have needs, and certainly not supposed to enjoy if we act on those wants or needs. And so then, like you said, the backdrop for her and how her experience of Catholicism was this sort of restrictive, don't have any sort of sexual desires. It's going to be really hard then to even be aware of what your desires, what your consent is, because you're taught that your consent is not as important. Your needs, your wants. If I have a want, if I have an orgasm, if I have arousal, that's not a good thing. And so I need to ignore it, similar to how a lot of our clients learn to ignore their hunger, like a parent telling them, you're not hungry, don't eat more of that, or you are hungry, eat that broccoli. And the kid's going, wait, no, but my belly's telling me I'm hungry. No, you're not hungry. And so then they learn, like, well, my consent is really not important here. It's this external voice telling me what I should do, or what I'm hungry for, or what I want, what I don't want. So it's even more reason we need to help people learn how to consent and learn how to identify what their wants are.
Yeah, no, I think that's critical. And I remember being shocked in the book where she mentioned that she stayed with Christopher, the quote, the fake name that we know is not real, but with she actually had a relationship with her lead rapist, and she said that she stayed with him until her parents left that part of town, and not knowing or understanding why she did, but it was that she said that her words didn't matter, because she was laying there and said no, and nobody stopped. So since stop didn't matter. So it was like, it literally, she talks about like this nothingness of her body. So I think you're right with the attachment. But when parents did come around to notice, because she talked about kind of putting on a show, and that was very difficult for her, but she was good at that and she was able to do that. But when parents did come around to notice, I think And again, I do believe parents do the best they can with what they have. But it sounded to me in her writing that the conversation revolved around her body being a problem. And so the solution was always weight loss. So she talked about the fat camps and the diet shakes and all these things. And that's where I found when you talked about the God complex earlier, I was like, I wish I could talk to the parents. Like, I wish I could help the parents see this just full body acceptance and, no, you know, bodies are not problems. And, you know, and again, I'm sure for various protection reasons, you know, she even says we're never going to know everything. And, you know, but I just think for the benefit of really understanding what she has been through, and for other listeners, that if we look and label anybody as a problem, we are missing the healing. We're missing the work. Could you speak to that a little bit more?
Totally. Because it's, you know, I mean, this makes me think of the body is not an apology, that whole movement. But it's so hard to extract from that, because we literally have been brainwashed to believe that thin is better and fat is worse, and that only thinner bodies are good. And so I think it's so hard to untangle, untangle from that, disentangle, there you go. From that thinking, but totally the body is not the problem. And you know, you had said, you were talking earlier about how you market to folks. And, you know, I similarly have gone through my own process of like, you know, how do I find my ideal client, which are generally people who are fat and who want to make, you know, peace with their body and food. So do I like put in my stuff, like looking for fat people to counsel, you know, like that's probably not going to be the right way and not a kind way perhaps to market. But with even the marketing I have, generally the people who call me, the first thing they say is, I'm feeling at rock bottom and I've tried everything and I want to lose weight. And I will, you know, have a conversation about here's what I do and what I don't do. And then they're on board. But even when they're calling me, they're often not even feeling safe to even say that, to even say, you know, like that they just want to make peace with their body. Like they feel like they have to say, well, I want to lose weight, even if they're already starting to think like maybe this is not the answer. And so I just think we're so brainwashed to think that the body's the problem and that's what we have to fix, versus maybe the way that we're thinking because of, you know, the messages we've heard, or even larger scale. And I know you're pretty active out there too. Like, and this is why that was in my bio. Like I struggle with working on, you know, like here I am working on an individual when the problem is really external to them. The problem is this culture that's telling them that they're wrong. So I really believe in working with people one-on-one, but that a huge part of that work has to be working on the larger issues and advocating to make the system different, so that we have less people who need to come to individual counseling and need to heal their relationship with body and food.
Yeah. Well, and I think that Roxane Gay, she nailed on some specific systemic problems, you know, that she must be aware of on her personal experience and wherever her work has taken her so far. So I specifically remember clothing sizes and
seating.
Yes. Airplane travel. She talks about, I mean, and just having a comfortable chair, eating out at restaurants, like so much. And she basically says, which I agree with, and this is not having to deal with it every day, but she says like the world is not designed for people in larger bodies. And she had an amazing quote that just kind of hurt my heart so bad. She said, the larger your body becomes, the more invisible you get, because you can't participate in things that other people can. And that to me is a big part of, I mean, will the CEOs of airlines question why they treat people in large bodies so poorly, and will they do something about it? You know, will clothing, you know, how can we improve the lives for people in larger bodies? Will do, you know, wonders for mental health and well-being. And certainly, you know, it will help when we work with people on an individual level. But I've definitely felt that frustration where it's like you're basically helping them with the best ways of thriving in a crappy situation of things you can't control.
Totally, which is, which I think is why it's important to name some of that stuff, and to not pretend like it doesn't exist, because I think otherwise we end up becoming part of the oppressive system, of like, oh, this is just in your head. Just like, what was it she said? There was a quote, it was something about like, it's a luxury, like to feel comfortable in one. Oh yeah, here we go. I've been thinking a lot about feeling comfortable in one's body and what a luxury that must be. Does anyone feel comfortable in their bodies? And I thought that was such an interesting thing to go into, like the luxury of feeling comfortable in your body. That's one of the biggest goals I work with on folks is feeling more comfortable in their body. But even that idea that it is a luxury, that not everyone gets to experience that. And so if we sort of, I've found myself at times as a therapist, almost like I'm pushing someone, like, come on, like, embrace yourself, like, just do this. And, and I have to check myself of like, look what they're up against. And my job isn't to fix them. I don't want to make them feel like they need to be fixed. I want to help them feel like, how they are is just how they're supposed to be. And so sometimes they're not going to be able to achieve that feeling of comfort in their bodies, but maybe at least they can be heard and validated of how crappy it does feel to feel that, how crappy it feels to be in a culture that makes them feel that way.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to share kind of what my thinking was in reading about like when Roxane went to Exeter and, so basically, so she had a trauma. Her mindset was the only way that I can survive this is to build this fortress, to become bigger, stronger, to fight off my attacker next time. And she acknowledges, and also because men don't like fat women, so I'll be safer if I can become a fat person. And so, and then layer that with not being around her family and family's cooking and being at Exeter, but like that there wasn't access. But she actually saw safety in being able to, eat, like what she writes it as eat, neat. And that for her, it was, what I was reading that is this was what she felt she needed to do to survive. And, because the parents just looking at the body as being the problem would do the dieting, which actually biologically sets up for weight cycling anyway. And she was fine with regaining the weight she lost because she wanted this larger body. So for a long part of her life, there was a beneficial purpose to her, say, not being an intuitive eater, right? What did you pick up on that part of the book?
It's making me think of, I know there was an article that, and I don't know if it's Virgie or Virgie, how you pronounce it, but Tovar, who writes such amazing stuff. But I read her article, which I'm sort of guessing is kind of a response to hunger. I know that there was some things back and forth, but, she, one of the images in that article was trauma does not equal fatness. And she goes on to, identify some problems with that narrative of, and sort of arguing that like we need to get away from like the trauma causes fatness. And there was so much of her article that I thought, this is so great. It's so valuable. And I think that weight and fatness is the result of lots of different things, not any one thing. And genetics more than anything, but also a whole myriad of factors and experiences and dynamics and food access and food insecurity and, cultural implications and dynamics rather. And so I, as a therapist and as someone who's worked with a lot of people with a lot of trauma, I have a lot of folks who had childhood sexual abuse or who had some sort of trauma in their past who have described just that same way, that they started to eat as a method of protection and that they wanted to get fat so that they would be unattractive to the perpetrator. And so I'm cautious to say that that's like a false understanding or false narrative, because I think for some folks it may be true that their relationship with food and their size may be something that was the result of some of the traumas they experienced. But I agree with the idea that it's not the only reason why people are certain sizes, or that size is bad to begin with, that larger size is bad to begin with. I don't know if I'm answering that part of the question you're asking.
You're bringing up something I want to get to anyway, so it does not matter.
Okay.
That's exactly what I was getting at too. And I read Virgie Tovar's article, and that actually was an internal concern I started to feel was, again, it's Roxane Gay's memoir of her body. It is her experience, and 100%, it's to be respected. There's nobody can judge anything about that. It's a person's story, and that is her story. That's her right to own. But I did have this fear bubble up inside of, oh my gosh, could people read this and assume that all people in larger bodies have had trauma?
Right.
Because you can't prove that. That's not necessarily, and so I do understand that, we want to make sure, I think that anyone would hope that Roxane could find peace and happiness in her current body, and I don't want to lose weight and yada, yada. Because she does say, she does say now that she hopes that she weighs less because she wants to be able to do more. And again, it's her experience. That's what's going on in her life. Because you can find somebody else that would say, my size is not limiting me. You would find someone else who says, well, my size is. And it's just, it can get very confusing. Exactly. Very murky. And so I think for the purposes of this podcast, I think for people to understand, for people to understand that you can have trauma in any size body, and Roxane's trauma response, she did what she could to eat and eat and eat. Somebody else could do that and could not gain weight because genetics maybe wouldn't let them. Or somebody else could have, she does mention bulimia in the book, so we know she at least identifies with that eating disorder, but somebody else could develop anorexia, so you don't really know how trauma is going to manifest. And we don't want to stigmatize bodies by making the assumption that all bodies that don't look like the ideal, oh, well, they must have a trauma. Or, if you struggle somewhere on the spectrum of, disordered eating, maybe some compulsiveness around eating or something like that. Or, oh, every time they're at a party, this person gets a second plate, they must have had trauma. No,
Right. Well, and I also think that narrative could potentially serve to stigmatize those who don't have trauma and are larger, it's kind of what you just said, but it's almost okay, we can have empathy for them if they had trauma, but otherwise they're just lazy and fat and, and bad, whereas it's well, we don't need to come up with a reason, we don't have to rationalize someone's size. Again, the body's not an apology. We don't have to have, a particular justification for the way that a person's body looks.
Exactly. And I think that is the bottom line, is everyone can make a firm commitment to not comment on other people's bodies, period, full stop. Just don't do it, because if it's you never know what's going on. How many clients have you had where they said that they've been congratulated? Even when I would diet in high school, and I was congratulated for these healthy behaviors, and I was so not being healthy, and you get congratulated for something, and it gets very twisted and messes you up even more. And so I think the problem is in our culture, it is acceptable and even recommended to comment on a person's appearance and their failure if they're in a larger body. And that is the BS. Right. That absolutely has to stop. You can't make up stories about other people. Genetics absolutely plays a role. Even healthism, it could just be a decision. I don't want to exercise, and you can have thin people who choose to never exercise, and they could be in a larger body too. It's just, I think it's the label. The label in general is so unhelpful.
Yeah. I do want to say one more thing though about that trauma piece, because again, really value the piece that Virgie, wrote. But I do think for some people that becoming larger was a protection for the trauma they experienced, and together with other factors, right? Together with all the other kind of stuff, genetics, yada, 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 access. But I think, and that's not a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
Like how wonderful for someone who experienced this horrible, horrible thing that they maybe were able to find a way to feel more protection, how awesome that they, were able to do that it doesn't have to be just this bad thing.
Yeah. Well, and that, I work with a lot of clients who struggle with binge eating disorder, and their mind is blown when I ask them, what is the beneficial purpose of your disorder? Like nobody's ever asked them how it could have been helpful.
Sure.
And I've had a client who had, for several reasons, had risk for suicide and was like, well, I did not act out on my plan. I'm like, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that it even gets at the notion when sometimes folks falsely believe or are falsely told that, well, if I just lose weight, then everything will be okay. And what you'll hear from a lot of folks who end up losing a tremendous amount of weight, will often describe like, oh, like actually it's now making me realize that some of these issues are still here and that the weight really wasn't the problem or wasn't what was, or maybe it was keeping me from looking at these things, but they were there before. So yeah, I think we attach so much to weight that it really doesn't deserve to have attached.
Yeah. And I just am so appreciative of her doing the difficult work to go there for herself for the benefit of other people, because I do think it's going to help a lot of other people. I think it's going to raise some eyebrows and hopefully help people think and learn and grow. She's very supportive of the fat acceptance movement and health at every size. And she clarifies, I struggle personally with self-acceptance, but I understand that this movement is critical and essential. And so the way I framed it all up in my mind is I 1,000% believe that she is truly trying to do the best she can with what she has, with her own unique experiences. And that includes, and I'm going to mention here just because I know I'm sharing the interview because I promised I would share it. And it's a good overall interview, but there was a little cringy point where she addresses about diets. And she had even mentioned Weight Watchers, but she had said, pretty much any diet will work. And she does say in the short term, right? But I felt like, and again, not a judgment, but just that kind of like, ooh, and I wish I could just add these words, that would then add to what we know, which she may not know yet, but about the long term, that it's temporary weight loss, that for a vast majority of the people, it would result in the body resisting and fighting back with a weight cycle or regain, or just you didn't really do the work on your food choices, so you can do something for a short term, but not long term. What are your thoughts on that?
There were things in there like, very briefly, like you said, very briefly, she mentions the health at every size movement, fat acceptance movement. But there was a lot when I was reading that made me think, I don't know that she really has. I mean, what do I know? I'm making a lot of assumptions, but like, there were just some things that I thought, I wonder if she has read some of the studies. Like, I wonder if she does have this information. Like, just, I don't mean like opinion or philosophy. Like, I mean like some of the science just that shows here's why dieting doesn't work, or here's why weight loss doesn't work, just from a pure factual science-based perspective. Because there were just things she said in there that made me think, I'm not sure that she has seen some of that, which wouldn't be surprising to me, because what do fat people get told all the time, is the opposite. You have to lose weight. You have to lose weight. You're bad. This is the answer. This is the answer. So I wondered, like, has she been exposed to some of that?
No, that's a really good point. And it made me think of this every time I'm about to wrap the show, which we're getting close. But every time I'm about to wrap, I'm like, oh, I have this idea. No, this is a good chat topic. But it also made me think of the timing of all of this. So 12, and it didn't sound like her body had gone through puberty at the time, the way she described herself as like super skinny and everything. Again, I'm just, I'm using her experience as a lens into what I know in research and experience I've had with clients. So it's really just the lens, but that puberty being a time where, and she's very tall. So we don't know what's her, she talks about her parents easily maintaining quote healthy weight ranges, right? And like her brother, I think, was a soccer pro. So she talks about kind of being like, oh, that's Roxane Gay, like the outlier in her family. But, any amount of historical genetics could have had an influence. So we know she's very tall, a large frame anyway, but that also with her actively engaging in eating disorder at the time of development, there is where your fat cells divide, right? And so, and when they're there, they're there. So it could be partially pre-genetic no matter what you do, but also partially at the timing she was struggling with it, that where she would jump in the growth curve, say, and then that's her new trend. And so, I remember her saying things, well, I don't, I can understand what was going on in this age range, but what was going on in my 30s? And, bodies will find a set point. And so I think that whether we're talking about her or other clients who've had similar experiences, the strong role genetics plays, but where behavior layers over that, and your body finds this range of a set point where it's likely to maintain, and no amount of dieting is going to help it.
Right. And, again, this is for me, like, information is power. Like, we need to give masses information. It's because I think science and having that kind of information can be so empowering to people to realize, like, oh, this isn't just something that's wrong with me. Like, there is, actual science going on inside my body, and I'm trying to fight against it when I'm doing these things. And what would it be like to actually work with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I guess, and we'll kind of each do this little thing, like if there was one like little, like if I could have the pleasure of getting to enjoy a meal with Roxane Gay, which I'm just like, the hair on my arms just stood up even saying that. But like, that's what I would talk about, is like pleasure and joy, and the role of food being pleasure and joyful, and not the fortress kind of things. Like I follow her on Twitter, and she talks about, oh, I could really enjoy a glass of rosé. And so I feel like that's very much a part of her vocabulary now, which I feel so happy about. And that would be what I would want to help reinforce, is reframing this idea that, yes, let's work to fight the injustices of culture, and at the same time, enjoying the life you have now, including good people in your life, great tasting food, and this body that has helped you write 3 bestsellers in a row. She really is a long-term story of resilience. No matter what.
Although it doesn't sound like she identifies with that, but no, I agree. Like with that idea of, like, if I was sitting down with her, I would want to ask about her writing process, like how she's been able to own her voice and put it out there. I think it's such a powerful one. I mean, you couldn't get more raw and get inside a person's head more than she writes in this book. So I just found it, I felt like honored listening, I had, like I said, those God moments. Oh, if only I was her therapist, and like times where I was like, oh, but overwhelmingly, I just felt like, wow, like listening to her story, it felt like such an honor to hear how she's moved through this world in a body that has so been, abused and taken over and not respected and undervalued and all that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, for listeners who can really relate to her experience, or, maybe they listen and then they read and they feel like they can really relate. It's like, I think our other message is we're all lifelong works in progress. And so how you can use her story as a chance to help yourself learn and grow, but then maybe take that next step and like thinking about, what is it that I might need to help myself feel satisfied and move through this world feeling like I'm taking care of myself? And that's a way deeper question than, were there celeries and carrot sticks on the plate today? But that's why people like you are around, to help them with resilience and flourishing, to really create a good and happy, healthy life.
Definitely.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the phone and, well, Skype, I should say, I guess, chat podcast with me today. And I look forward to sharing some links to some of the articles you mentioned as well in the show notes. So where can listeners connect with you online or social media, or if you want to kind of let us know where we can find you?
Yeah. My website is threebirdscounselling.com. And you can find links on there to my social media, but my Facebook page is Body Politics with Dr. Maria Paredes. And I have an Instagram account that's Three Birds Counseling. So yeah, I'd love to connect with folks if they want to say hi or share some material with me. I love seeing, like, there's just so much great content out there now. I know you share a lot of it, and it's exciting to see how social media has changed from something that was so toxic and still is or can be, but that now it can be used in such a really helpful way.
Yes. You have to choose how you're going to use social media. Sometimes I want to put it in a dumpster and just set fire to it.
Yes. Agreed.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Rebecca.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. I would love if you could take a minute and leave a rating and review on iTunes. I know they don't make it very easy, so I have a few quick tips for you. First, launch the Apple Podcast app, and then you're going to click the search button to enter the name Body Kindness, and you'll find my podcast. You'll see the album art. And when you click on the album art, there is going to be a button in the middle at the top. It's called Reviews. Click that. And then when you scroll to the bottom, you will see an option to leave a review. And so you'll click that button and go ahead and write your thoughts. I also would love ideas for future episodes. You can email me, Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com. Again, that's Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com. I love chatting about the show and how it's helpful. And so keep those emails coming. And also, if you're not yet completed with the e-course, don't forget that's a free resource for anyone who's interested in practicing body kindness. If you visit bodykindnessbook.com and click on Get Started, just enter in your name and email and you'll get instant access. I'll see you there.